This episode was recorded before Russia invaded Ukraine. The interview with Branko provides a lot of useful context on how we got here.
Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Halper.
I'm Aaron Matte.
How you doing, Aaron?
I'm well. Now, Katie, I have a content question.
Yeah.
About Useful Idiots. As you know, in the first episode of my run here at Useful Idiots, I disclosed that I'm not just now a new temporary co-host, but I'm also a paying subscriber at usefulidiots.substack.com, which makes me a huge fan of the original Useful Idiots team, Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi. And I'm wondering, taking off my co-host hat here, just as a consumer, as a content consumer, I am pining for some Katie Halper and Matt Taibbi content. I'd love to see a reunion. Is there anything I can do to fill that need?
You could go to, thank you for bringing this up, you could go to youtube.com/The Katie Halper Show and check out a very good episode that we did with none other than, wait for it, Matt Taibbi.
Wow.
It's true, Aaron. I can't believe you asked. What fortuitous timing with this question. Yeah.
You're saying right now, just as I am pining for some Katie Halper, Matt Taibbi content, there is.
It's there.
Amazing.
It's there. It's
wow.
amazing. With not only Matt Taibbi, but I have Matt Taibbi on, and I have him talking with Katrina vanden Heuvel. So I got two guests. First is just me and Matt Taibbi. Great chat. Then it's me, Taibbi, and Katrina, and it's great because you get to watch Katrina and Taibbi, who've spent time in the former Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, but also afterwards in Russia, talk about Russia and Ukraine. And then if you're a Patreon subscriber, you get to hear an extended interview I did with Katrina vanden Heuvel, and that's at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And we have a great show for you today. We're so excited to be talking to Branko Marcetic, Jacobin writer who's written some amazing pieces about not only the conflict Russia-Ukraine, but also the media's coverage of it and politicians kind of ginning up of tensions. So very excited about that.
Yes, Branko's done a lot of work on this topic. Wrote a great book all about Joe Biden.
Oh yeah, Yesterday's Man.
And has a lot of insight into how Ukraine factors into Joe Biden's political career, and there's a lot to talk about there. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Branko has to say.
Yeah, very excited. If you want to hear an interesting discussion about, we're not going to get into it quite yet, but we will, and maybe a Substack only one, Vaush. Aaron got into a little thing with Vaush. So just a little teaser. You can access that at Substack, usefulidiots.substack.com. And
if you have no idea who Vaush is, you're lucky. But if you want to learn who Vaush is, you can tune in at Substack, at our Substack.
Yeah. And should we just get to the 4 basic food groups?
That's why we're here. Let's do it. All right, so I have Democrats suck, and we have to do like a lightning round because there's so much Democratic suckiness
for you this week. Yeah,
there's so much Democratic suckiness to get in, so we got to just go through as much as we can. And the main thing is Ukraine. The Biden administration has been warning for weeks now that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. There's been a million different allegations. There's going to be a Russian coup where they install a pro-Russian leader. They're going to round people up and put them in camps. That's one of the most recent allegations. There's going to be false flags with videos and dead bodies.
Crisis
actors, exactly. And now they're confronting with a mess that I think they have a major role in creating. So let's hear what our Vice President, Kamala Harris, has to say.
I mean, listen, guys. We're talking about the potential for war in Europe. I mean, let's really take a moment to understand the significance of what we're talking about. It's been over 70 years. And through those 70 years, as I mentioned yesterday, there has been peace and security. We are talking about the real possibility of war in Europe. So our position is for us very clear, which is as a leader, which we have been, bringing together the allies, working together around our collective and unified position, that we would all, not just prefer, we desire, we believe, it is in the best interest of all that there is a diplomatic end to this moment.
Putting aside that Kamala is warning about a threat of war that her administration, I think, has put a major part in fueling and pretending as if this is somehow some abstract thing that the U.S. has very little power over, when really it's, I think, the key player here. Putting that aside, the historical revisionism don't know if you heard that, Katie. She goes, Europe has been at peace and in stability for 70 years, forgetting a couple of things. First of all, Ireland, there was a major fight there for a long time with freedom fighters trying to have independence. So there's that whole thing. And then just looking on the U.S. role, the U.S. in the last 30 years has been involved in 2 interventions in the 1990s, most recently in Kosovo, when U.S. intervention basically actually led to the creation of a breakaway state of Kosovo, which the U.S. was the first to recognize, which is especially ironic given that now the U.S. is condemning Putin for condemning these breakaway republics in Ukraine. So her and her aides, because obviously these talking points are rehearsed, happen to forget just some key history.
Yeah, what's weird is that I get that these people are very U.S. centric, but you'd think that they'd remember just the ones that the U.S. intervened in, right? Just Kosovo, maybe not Ireland, but the Kosovo thing, you'd think that they'd remember just because the U.S. did play a role in that. But maybe she's being modest. Yeah, I don't know who checks her talking points, but that's pretty ridiculous.
Team Kamala, got to step it up.
Yeah, you really got to step it up. Send him to me or Aaron. We'll help you.
Now, we don't just have to think about how this conflict is impacting Europe. There's also the fact that this has consequences for average Americans. And there's an article in CBS News that talks about the consequences. It's called How the Ukraine Crisis is Already Hitting Americans' Wallets. Although many Americans may prefer that the U.S. stay out of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the brewing violence and political fallout are already hurting their wallets. Gasoline prices, which have hit 8-year highs, could surge even further if the hostilities escalate or if U.S. lawmakers pass another round of sanctions. The economic impact could also move beyond the gas pump, Wall Street analysts warn. Sanctions or export controls against Russia could make current semiconductor shortages even worse, while restrictions on wheat or metals could drive the fiercest bout of inflation in decades to climb even higher. So after the Biden administration basically gave up on Build Back Better, now they're deciding to hit average Americans' pocketbooks even more by ginning up this conflict with Russia and threatening these major sanctions, which risk cutting off Russian energy supplies, which help power a large part of Europe. So raising energy prices, not just for Europeans, but also even for Americans as well. Part of the strategic brilliance of the Biden administration.
Yeah, it's all good. I mean, it's what's not to love? You love to see it. It's an intersectional approach to politics, economic, military.
Luckily, though, there are voices in media who are willing to shoulder the burden. And let's go to one of them speaking this week on Meet the Press.
But also the thing that you hear President Biden saying is Americans need to be prepared for if this comes to our shores and it comes to our shores in the effect of higher gas prices. When we already are seeing an 8-year high, we're already seeing inflation at 40-year highs. So the president is also trying to tell Americans, if we have to get involved here, the cost of freedom may be in your wallets at the gas tank.
So you hear that, Katie? If the U.S. has to continue its quest for a client state on Russia's borders and expanding NATO's to Russia's borders, that in Yamisha's rendering is the cost of freedom. It's freedom if we have a puppet in Ukraine and NATO on Russia's borders. And Americans will have to shoulder the burden by paying more for gas. That's just the cost of freedom. It is what it is.
It's a small price for freedom. It's a small price. I'll drive for freedom. I'll fill up my tank for freedom.
And meanwhile, let's just turn quickly to some of the voices who are there to make sure that Americans know we're on the right side of freedom and make sure that anyone who questions the cost of freedom, like fueling a proxy war in Ukraine and having higher energy prices as a result.
Literally fueling it, right?
Literally fueling it. Yes, literally fueling it. There are some voices in the Democratic Party to make sure to remind us, if anybody questions the cost of freedom, they're there to remind us whose side these doubters are really on. So let's go to a tweet first from Matthew Dowd, architect of George W. Bush's reelection campaign in 2004. Now, of course, like many other fellow neocons, he's a Democrat. Right. And this is what he says. If you are blaming Biden today for what Putin is doing in Ukraine, please take down the American flag from your home or social media account and replace it with the Russian flag. It will help us all know where you clearly stand.
Shit. Wait, I wish I had some time. I don't have time right now because we're filming. The American flag that I have up on my, my wall in front of my apartment building that I drape outside of my, my window. I'm not going to have time to remove it until after we're done filming. So apologies.
I mean, Katie, you have to remove this massive flag on your building. Right. And then you have to swap it with a massive Russian flag. Right. This is going to take all day for you.
It is, yeah. And you're not, I got to have someone come over to help me do it. And if you can't help me do it, you're helping.
In my case, it's just like I have like 50 different social media accounts. I have my alts, I have my sub alts, so I'm gonna have to go through all those and remove the American flag and replace it with the Russian.
I know, that's so annoying. Also, I'm gonna have to remove the, I have all my blazers and jackets and coats and winter coats. They all have little American flag lapel pins, so I'm gonna have to trade those for Russia pins.
I have a back tat. I have a back tat of the American flag.
Oh, yeah,
it's right,
so you're gonna have to
right above the buttocks in that lower back area.
Yeah, right.
In the tramp stamp area,
Yeah, and right.
And I'm gonna have to get that laser removed and then get the Russian flag tattooed over top of it.
Right.
Jeez.
You may be able to work it out so that you don't have to get it removed and you can just add the Russia thing. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Because there are some similar colors. They're both red, white, and blue.
Overlap. Right. There is overlap. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you can make it like an optical illusion, so somehow it looks like the Russian flag. But
that's my best bet.
That's probably your best bet. There's a lot to do, a lot to think about, and I'm really glad that Dowd is like giving us a heads up about this, because you could have gone through the rest of your life with that American flag tramp stamp right there.
I know. So that's Democrat suck.
Yeah, well, that is a lot of Democrat sucking. This episode is brought to you by the Jordan Harbinger Show.
Want a new podcast to look forward to each week? One that's entertaining, informative, and packed with actionable content? Come on, of course you do.
The average podcast listener has 6 shows in rotation, so you're most likely not just listening to useful idiots. And that's totally okay. In fact, I'd love to share a podcast to add to your list.
The Jordan Harbinger Show, a top shelf podcast named Best of Apple in 2018, only 4 years ago. So don't just ignore my suggestion to listen to this one like you probably do with your other friends who tell you to listen to podcasts.
Because Jordan delves into the minds of fascinating people, from athletes, authors, and scientists to mobsters, spies, and hostage negotiators.
Guests include Anderson Cooper, Matthew McConaughey, Mark Cuban, and even Ulrich the Mole Larson. I don't know who that is, but I'm sure he's really interesting.
Yeah, he sounds Scandinavian. Those are always good people. Search for the Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Visit jordanharbinger.com/start.
For Republicans Suck, let's just go to this video featuring wonderful Californian Republican Madison Cawthorn.
The Green New Deal is a disaster. It's not a climate plan. It's a socialist manifesto, a Trojan horse for communism in America. I am tired of watching the DC swamp and political insiders capitulate to socialism. This is why I've come up with a bold constitutional plan. It's called the New Contract with America. We cannot build down. If we want change, real change, we have to come together and build America up. This is the world I envision. It's time to liberate the American people from government overreach that violates our freedom and robs us of our dignity. You come first. America comes first. The New Contract with America is an America First vision that takes the power away from government bureaucracy and puts it back into the hands of the people. It restores our liberties and builds a plan to preserve our freedom for future generations. I choose freedom. America chooses freedom.
So that, of course, is a throwback, a callback, if you will, to the contract with America that Newt Gingrich brought into being. But this is the New Contract with America, and it outlines 10 overarching pillars for the GOP. Government spending, economy, government reform, healthcare, education, culture and family unit, energy and environment, immigration, technical innovation, and defense and veterans. And here are just some of the changes that the contract calls for. Slashing government spending by a third by 2031, enacting a balanced budget amendment, and abolishing the income tax and finding a replacement flat tax or consumption tax by 2026. The contract also calls for abolishing the Department of Education, making English the official language of the United States, banning federal funding for critical race theory teachings, and enacting school choice on the federal level, so federal dollars follow the students to their school of choice, including private religious schools. So, you know, the guy's got it all laid out. Sounds like a good contract. I'm glad that he's going after the communist Green New Deal. For people who are just listening and not watching, there's some hammer and sickles in there. The production value is pretty good. What do you think, Aaron? What do you think of the video?
I mean, first of all, does anyone remember the contract for America? And do they remember how actually unpopular that was? Like Newt Gingrich, I remember him bragging about like how great this was, but I remember polls showing that no one liked actually whatever was in the contract for America, which I'm sure was just like, you know, lower taxes for the rich.
Right. Yeah.
Republicans stand for.
Yes.
So they couldn't come up with anything better than just adding a new? I know,
it's really pathetic. Yeah, just adding a new. It's pathetic when Newt Gingrich is your source for inspiration.
Yeah.
I mean, the only inspiring thing about Newt Gingrich is when he did a great interview. He was interviewed by Ali G. That was great. I don't know if you saw that.
I do remember that. Yeah.
It was a great moment.
And just like marketing wise, I just, you know, look, Trump tried this in 2020 when he was painting Biden as a socialist, but it's just not going to fly because everyone knows, whether you like the Democrats or not, that they're like elite coastal liberals who
if only they were
love billionaires, who serve billionaires, you know? Yeah. And so to try to pretend that they're all radical socialists who are going to bring in communism, it's just not going to fly. People aren't going to buy it.
Well,
but the problem is Republicans.
Some people do, but it's a limited audience, and I don't think they're convincing people.
I think it's a limited pool that obviously you're going to convince your diehard Republicans, but if you want to win an election, you need to win over more people.
Right. Yeah.
And the problem is like Republicans are in this bind where they serve billionaires to the same extent that Democrats do. In fact, even more really, given that it was Republicans who pushed through Trump's tax heist, the largest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. So Republicans can't really run, or at least most Republicans can't really run on this like fake populist platform.
Right.
So instead they have to pretend as if really they're fighting against the specter of communism for coming to the country. But the problem is it just doesn't work anymore. People don't buy it.
Right. He's a big liar, by the way.
Is he?
Madison. Yeah. He lies about everything from saying the election was stolen to then saying the election wasn't stolen. He even lied about, you know, he for people who don't know or didn't watch, he's in a wheelchair. And he lied about the friend who fell asleep at the wheel, which is why he's in a wheelchair. He suffered from some paralysis, but he said the friend left him to die in a fiery hell. The friend actually pulled him out. You know, he said that he didn't get into the Naval Academy because of his accident. Actually, he was rejected before the accident happened. So, also been accused of sexual harassment. Seems like a pretty disgusting guy. Multiple women said he did terrible things and just kind of like sleazy things. And also at least two RAs said that they warned people against going on dates with him. He would drive women, allegedly drive them to like faraway spots and ask them weird sexual questions.
Tough spokesperson for a new contract then.
Yeah, it's true.
Tough sell.
Yeah, tough sell, yeah.
But hey, props to the graphics to the graphics team.
Yeah, the graphics team. Yeah.
They created a communist hellscape pretty effectively,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and I like their little then they had Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah.
Like coming down on a house. Yeah, for people who haven't seen the video, which you should, but if people are just listening, I think Aaron described it well. It's a communist hellscape. Terrible politics, great graphics. That's the Republican Party.
All right. So for Isn't That Weird, this was an exciting week, everybody, because it was the kind of debut. It was the soft launch of Trump's brand new social media network called Truth Social. Katie, have you signed up for Truth Social yet?
I haven't. Should I?
I mean, yeah.
Follow the truth. I want to follow the truth.
Yeah.
How do we do this?
Well, the problem is you can't. You can't. And in fact, useful idiots, we tried to sign up and it looks like we are what, Matt? We are number 422,001 on the Truth Social waiting list.
And counting quickly. We'll be there soon.
Yeah, apparently they couldn't get the launch going properly. So now there's a waiting list, which is kind of, I'm sure will excite some people. They're on the waiting list for this exclusive new Trump social media platform.
We're on the waiting list.
Yeah, we got
We're
in the
on it?
second day. Whenever we
looking
get
at
in, we will keep people updated, and I will start posting a lot on Truth Social. I'm going to get the truth out there.
I do have to say, it is tough to be a Republican in the social media era because there has been a bias against them. We have to acknowledge that.
Sure.
I mean, the best examples were before the election, Twitter, Facebook wouldn't allow anyone to share the articles about Hunter Biden's laptop, claiming it might be Russian disinformation. That was straight up censorship.
Right. You might as well, if you did that, that was basically getting a Russian flag tramp stamp.
Exactly. Right. Exactly right. And Parler, which was a popular social network for conservatives, that was just straight up shut down without any respect for the Constitution. I think. I mean, no matter what you think about Parler, I know was a cesspool for all kinds of awful stuff, but so is everything. So is Facebook and so is Twitter. I mean, either you believe in free speech or you don't. So Republicans are being forced to create all these new social networks, but it's hard when you're not big tech. You don't have the infrastructure to do it, and so that's why Trump's Truth Social had such a unsuccessful launch.
Yeah, he must be so angry. Although everything works, he can work everything to his advantage now. It just shows how under attack he is. So that's probably useful.
I'm sure this will help that brand. Yes. I mean, every attack on him ultimately helps him in that sense because he can say, and he can it helps his whole con because remember his whole thing in 2016 was to make America great again, to rescue the working class. He did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. All he did, his only major legislative achievement was passing a massive tax cut for the wealthy. But the fact that he's being censored, banned from Twitter, there was the whole investigation of him being a possible Russia agent. He can point to all these things and say, look, it's their fault. I couldn't get my agenda done. Yeah, and people do find that persuasive among his base.
Right. It's their fault that I can't get Truth Social up and running.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about Noom. I'm a fan. What is Noom Weight? Well, it's a psychology-based approach to getting people on track to eating healthier. And through a combination of psychology, technology, and human coaching, their platform has helped millions of users meet their personal health and wellness goals. Noom understands that the weight loss journey is difficult and filled with ups and downs. That's why they believe it's about progress, not perfection, because everybody's journey is different. Noom doesn't believe in restricting what you can or can't eat. Instead, Noom gives you the knowledge and wisdom you need to make informed choices. An off day is totally okay and won't set you off course. Noom Weight gently helps you get back on track. You're the boss. You decide how Noom Weight fits into your life, not the other way around. Sign up for your trial and get psychology-based support and motivation to reach your goal at noom.com/idiots. That's NOOM.com/IDIOTS to sign up for your trial. Well, okay, that's an isn't that weird and isn't that terrible in some ways. And now I got another isn't that terrible for you. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Lots of times I have to go out of my way to find penis-related content, but this one just fell into my lap, so to speak. So, reading from Reuters. Unfortunately, the New York Post didn't cover this. They just had the Reuters piece in it, but I know if they had covered it, it would have been much more pun-filled than this one, this was very disappointing prose. But just reading from Reuters, the men's 50-kilometer mass start race at the Beijing Games was shortened to 30K, but that did little to help Finland's Remi Lindholm, who needed a heat pack at the end of the race to thaw out a particularly sensitive body part. Lindholm spent just under an hour and 16 minutes traversing the course in howling, freezing winds, leading to his penis becoming frozen for the second time in a cross-country skiing race following a similar incident in Ruka, Finland last year. Quote, "You can guess which body part was a little bit frozen when I finished the men's Olympic 50K race. It was one of the worst competitions I've been in. It was just about battling through," he told Finnish media. With organizers worried about frostbite during Saturday's race, it was delayed by an hour and shortened by 20K. The thin suits and underlayers worn by racers, as well as plasters to cover their face and ears, offered little protection. Lindholm explained that he used a heat pack to try to thaw out his appendage once the race was over. When the body part started to warm up after the finish, the pain was unbearable, he added. So I guess in a weird way, it was easier to deal with when it was frozen, because I guess he didn't feel it, right? He was numb. The real pain came when it started melting, which is a positive because you want to return it to a normal heat range. I don't know if does he have a particularly vulnerable penis, because it says it had happened before. And I think they mean just to him, not others. So maybe he can talk to other skiers about like how they keep their penises, their appendages warm, or if not warm, non-frozen, thawed.
I mean, if I were him, I definitely would make this issue a top priority.
Yeah, he should campaign on it. I mean, he should be creating some new sportswear that actually keeps your penis warm.
Absolutely. I would devote, if I had experienced this issue not once but twice.
Yeah,
I would devote my life to resolving it.
I mean, not to blame the victim, but maybe you
I'm going to blame the victim.
All right, yeah, you know what? It happens once, okay. Then it's on you.
Mm-hmm.
What were you wearing? You shouldn't have worn those pants, because obviously they don't work well. But why not just like, what would you do in that situation? Like, what about a bunch of tinfoil or like those things you put in your hand warmers? But maybe you don't want to put that there, or you don't know what kind of birth defect.
I would retire. I would just retire.
You would just retire, yeah. Really? You'd give it all up?
I would give it all up, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That would sufficiently scare me into retirement, for sure.
Yeah. I would actually become probably some kind of scientist and invent some great fabric, penis warming fabric. PWF.
Well, listen, I mean, that would be a wonderful invention.
It would be, right? I'd make a lot of money.
There would be people with penises participating in winter sports all around the world who would be forever grateful.
There are probably so many people with penises who don't even partake in that out of fear.
Out of fear, yes.
Yeah, frostbite fear.
Yes.
That's my new American new contract for America. It's my new contract for the world, actually. We are the world. Well,
you have I mean, look, that's a bipartisan issue for sure. That crosses partisan lines.
Yeah.
You're going to get your far left cold penises and your far right cold penises, and everyone's going to align behind warmth. Yeah.
We can all get behind opposing frostbitten penises. So that's an isn't that terrible? But isn't that terrible that breeds a real opportunity for innovation? And
isn't that terrific? You've heard talk about how important it is to have a VPN to protect your online privacy, but choosing a VPN you can trust is equally as important. I can say with full confidence that Expressvpn is the best VPN on the market. Here's why. Number one, Expressvpn doesn't log your activity online. Lots of cheap or free VPNs make money by selling your data to advertisers, but Expressvpn doesn't do this. Number two is speed. Expressvpn now uses Lightway, a new VPN protocol they engineered to make user speeds faster than ever. I've tried many VPNs in the past, and they can sometimes slow my connection. But Expressvpn is always blazing fast and lets me stream videos in HD quality with zero buffering. The last thing that really sets Expressvpn apart is how easy it is to use. You don't need any technical skills. Just fire up the app and tap one button to connect. Use our link, expressvpn.com/useful today and get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/useful. Visit express.com/useful to learn more.
So excited to be bringing onto the show Branko Marcetic. He's a writer at Jacobin, the co-host of the 1 of 200 podcast, and the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And you can follow him at bmarcetic, which is, get ready, BMarceTich. Welcome, Branko. So excited to have you on.
Well, I'm very excited to be here.
Wanted to just start off by quoting a piece that you wrote. It's a great opening, and it's at Jacobin, and you write, "It's January, a defiant crowd of protesters, a jumble of bodies, where far-right extremists rub shoulders with everyday people, wants the head of the elected president. They chant anti-government slogans, occupy government buildings, and carry arms. Some of them makeshift melee weapons, some of them hunting rifles and Kalashnikovs. By the time it's all said and done, the demonstrations will lead to the death and hospitalization of both protesters and police. It's not the Capitol riot in Washington that so horrified Americans and foreign observers in 2021. This was the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution, or Euromaidan, which right around this time 8 years ago actually succeeded in toppling the country's elected government, sending then-President Viktor Yanukovych fleeing for his life to neighboring Russia. And that's from your piece at Jacobin called "A U.S.-backed far-right-led revolution in Ukraine helped bring us to the brink of war." And then your subtitle is, "In 2014, Ukraine, great power, gamemanship, righteous anger at a corrupt status quo, and opportunistic far-right extremists toppled the government in the Maidan revolution. Today's crisis in Ukraine can't be understood without understanding Maidan." So why is it that it can't be understood without understanding that? And what is there to understand?
Boy, those are big questions, both.
I know.
I mean, obviously the current crisis over Ukraine, its roots are way deeper and longer, way before Maidan. But that was sort of the if we're going to trace this current crisis to one single event in recent history, I think Maidan, the Maidan Revolution would be it, because that was what ousted this not quite pro-Russian, but at least Russian-friendly president
curious
at the time. Yeah, and really sent Ukrainian politics into this more nationalistic direction and a more pro-Western direction, more aligned with the West and towards NATO. And I think that is basically what this entire thing is about, this kind of game of brinkmanship that Putin is playing with the West right now. What is there to understand about it? So much. I think one of the things I wanted to do with that piece was to challenge or to put a different, more comprehensive perspective on the protests and the revolution. In the West, in the US, the revolution tends to get cast as this pretty unambiguously liberal and good thing. And certainly there were many worthy demands that were in the protests. Many of the people, most of the people that were taking part in it were in favor of anti-corruption and liberal values and more political freedoms, that kind of thing. But there were many different elements going on there. And one of the contingents of that revolution happened to be the far right. And the reason why I bring up January 6th is because I think it's an interesting way to sort of get people to understand why, people who have a less positive view of the Maidan revolution feel that way. Everyone in the US, quite understandably, was sort of rocked by the images they saw on January 6th, the flying of Confederate flags and all sorts of far-right symbols, along with sort of a hodgepodge of kind of politically confused protesters and rioters. And people kind of found it a very shocking scene, and quite rightly so. But what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was very much like that, but kind of in steroids. There was far more violence. There was actual killing of police and attacking of police with guns and other pretty serious weapons by the protesters, which didn't really happen on January 6th. Most the people who died were either the protesters themselves, or they died from kind of not natural causes, but strokes and that kind of thing afterwards. So it's a much more extreme version of what happened on January 6th. And I think if people start to understand that the Ukrainian revolution in those terms, they start to maybe understand why it is that the politics in Ukraine and the tensions between Ukraine and Russia have really kind of spiraled ever since then.
And you point out in your piece that Washington, including many of the people who are currently in the Biden administration, right up to the president himself, played a critical role in the Maidan coup. Talk to us about that. People like Victoria Nuland and Joe Biden himself, what they did to basically undermine attempts to resolve the Maidan crisis and force Yanukovych into fleeing.
Yeah, so first thing to remember is that the United States was involved, first of all, the United States and the West, by supporting kind of pro-democracy groups, organizations, initiatives in Ukraine. And that had been happening for years. It was happening in 2004. It was played a role in the color revolution that happened there. That in that case, it actually stopped Yanukovych from coming to power because he had won the elections in what were pretty widely considered fraudulent. And I quote the Center for American Progress, the kind of preeminent liberal and Democratic Party institution. And it says, they said at the time, does the US meddle in Ukrainian politics? Yes, of course it does. We would call it something different. We would call it democracy promotion or, a bunch of other euphemisms. But of course, the United States meddles and they're trying to get the political outcome they want, which in that case was Ukrainian politics after 2004 was not made any less corrupt and authoritarian as Ukrainians wanted, but it did mean that there was a more pro-Western tilt in Ukrainian politics. And the same sort of thing happens in 2013, where the United States, through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, which, one of its people basically described it as, this is what the CIA does, but we do it out in the open. It's not a verbatim quote, it's a paraphrase, but that's what they said. And the idea was that you would funnel money into, whether it's pro-democracy groups or towards reactionary organizations like the Contras in Nicaragua, whatever particular factions in the country were going to be most convenient for achieving, Washington's interests, perceived interests. And in that case, in 2013 and 2014, what the United States was funding was pro-democracy groups that were run by sort of some of the neoliberal politicians in Ukraine. And I don't want to overstate things. I don't want to say that the US was the only reason that these revolutions happened or that these protests happened. That would be that would be going a little far. But it is true that the United States did support some of these groups that were instrumental in getting people onto the streets. And they did it, not because necessarily they cared that much about corruption or, authoritarianism in Ukraine, but because they had particular geopolitical interests that they wanted to make real. And so that's basically what ended up happening at the beginning. Once the revolution starts to really heat up, because Yanukovych starts gunning people down and sort of cracking down on the protests to try and end them, always a bad idea. Of course, what that does is just sort of inflames anti-government feeling more and more protesters come to the street. And at that point, the U.S.
One thing, there was though also the Maidan Massacre, where Yanukovych was accused of firing on the Maidan protesters, but research by a political scientist at the University of Ottawa, I think personally, pretty convincingly shows that actually that was perpetrated by the opposition side.
Yeah, absolutely. Even Kachanovsky, I believe, did a study of some of the evidence that came out afterwards, and there's eyewitnesses who say that when they heard the shooting definitely came from the direction of, say, there was a hotel that was occupied by anti-government forces at the time, and other buildings there in the square similarly occupied. And also, if you look at some of the wounds and some of the forensic evidence, the ammunition that was used on both protesters and police, it was identical, and that sort of lends weight to it. There's other evidence too. There was a figure actually who was imprisoned in Russia. So she, by no means a pro-Putin person. She said that similarly she saw a Ukrainian politician leading people to a protester-occupied place, and these people were carrying rifles. So there's definitely evidence to suggest that the far right or certain nationalist elements were sort of using this, or even trying to stoke conflict and to raise the tensions. But once you have all these protesters coming out and people are getting very fiery, the US kind of more explicitly comes out in support. And so you have Victoria Nuland giving out sandwiches to the protesters. You also have John McCain.
Can you explain who Victoria Nuland is for people?
Yeah, she was a diplomat, a State Department official who was ended up taking a very instrumental role, particularly after Yanukovych was toppled. There was a recording that came out that was very embarrassing for the United States. where and it was probably released by Russia. They managed to surveil her, and then they put this out. And of course, all the outrage was about Russia putting out this intelligence, and not so much about what was said on the tape. And
Branko, we have the clip. Actually, we have a clip of the tape.
Well, let's
go to that.
To it.
U.S. is making all these allegations against Russia, including plotting a coup inside Ukraine and choosing a new government. Just imagine if a tape would come out of Russian officials speaking about the Ukrainian government in the way that Victoria Nuland does here.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay.
And they also go on to say that they're going to get the blessing of Joe Biden, get to give it the attaboy in their words. And Victoria Nuland also says, fuck the EU, because they're trying to exclude them from this process. Because what they're trying to do is basically undermine any kind of compromise, which was reached, that could keep Yanukovych in power. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, instead of everyone adhering to a resolution that was reached, brokered by the EU, which Nuland said basically to fuck off, there was more violence. Yanukovych fled, and that basically led to a new government. And the prime minister of that new government was exactly who Victoria Nuland had selected when she said Yats is the guy, Yatsenyuk. And that reference to this guy Tunnerbrook, I think he's a far right figure, right? And I think she was basically saying that he can't come into the government because he's too far right extremist. It wouldn't look very good for the new coup government that she was plotting to help install.
Yeah, but of course, members of the far right did end up taking certain plum roles in that interim government and in governments after that, even though they weren't maybe quite as extensive as that initial first post-Maidan government. So, it's a matter of kind of perhaps having a figurehead, or at least someone who is going to be publicly facing, who doesn't have some of these red flags that looks bad, but these elements are going to get in anyway. And it's worth noting that
red flags, not in the Russian sense of communist sense of red flags, different kinds of red flags.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, I think. It's worth noting as well that while the protests are happening, John McCain, the late great John McCain, who never met a war he didn't want to stoke or send people to die in, went to Maidan. He said that, gave his support to the protesters, as did Chris Murphy, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat. He went too, and they both met with one of the far right leaders in Ukraine and basically stood with them as they pronounced to the crowd that they backed him. So I think maybe that doesn't sound that extreme, but I want people to remember, think back in 2016, 2017, when the mere idea of Russia through Facebook memes and bots and other things of that nature were supporting Black Lives Matter protests or voicing support for, say, anti-war activists. Things that I think everyone here and probably most people watching would agree are good things that are worth supporting. However, that was widely interpreted by not just US officials, but a lot of journalists and a lot of Americans as sort of an inappropriate wading into another country's politics. Okay, sure, maybe
Pearl Harbor. It was Pearl Harbor.
Sorry, yeah.
Donald Adler said it was the same thing as Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's right. It was the worst attack on America in its modern history.
Jesus masturbation memes were very powerful.
That's right. Well, don't forget that
beat it together.
There was also the Buff Bernie meme.
That is true. Never forget.
An attempt to defeat America through stoking horniness. One of the great strategies. But people at the time, right? They hyperventilated about this, and I think that was way over the top. But there was a core kind of objection there, which wasn't completely unreasonable, which is the idea that, hey, whatever you think about this, whatever problems we're having, these are our problems. That this is within our national territory. You don't have the right to come in here and meddle with that. Okay, well, if you believe in that principle and don't just sort of apply it with it happens to align with something that with your government or something that you believe in, then you have to look at it from the point of view of Ukrainians as well, where the U.S. government was kind of putting its thumb on the scale, sort of voicing support for a protest movement that was not majority supported in Ukraine. Ukraine, as we're seeing now, is deeply polarized because of geographical and historical reasons. And so not everyone was backing the Maidan revolution, which, along with all the good things about anti-corruption and more democracy and the like, it was also about moving Ukrainian foreign policy more towards the West and away from Russia, which people in the East didn't necessarily agree with. So that's a very long answer, which I hope has maybe answered some of your question.
It was very helpful. And Maidan, just so people know, it just means square, right? And that's where the protests were taking place. So that's why it turned into that, that's why it's called that. But just one thing. So you said that Yanukovych, he shot at people, but I know that you also cited the evidence that Aaron just brought up from the Ottawa professor, because I know you mentioned that in one of the articles. So is the idea that, like, there were other times when the government shot at people, but not all the times? Or is it just that we don't even know if they ever shot at people?
I mean, I think there's eyewitness testimony and stuff that suggests that Ukrainian forces were firing on protesters. So it's not as if the far right elements were the only ones who are potentially in this. But then also, as for the detail of that, I mean, I'm not sure who fired on who, were the Ukrainian forces firing on some of the more violent protesters, because you have to remember that the protesters were carrying not just makeshift melee weapons, but rifles.
Right.
And of course there were far right elements in those protests that were always kind of the ones that were most itching for some sort of violent confrontation. So were they firing on them? Doesn't necessarily make it more justifiable, but that is, I think, a question to ask. The whole thing is so chaotic that it's very difficult to say. But I think it is important that if there is evidence that far right individuals were kind of playing a role in heightening the violence that was happening and sort of escalating things, and that's kind of a significant detail if we are going to talk about this sort of revolution and who to blame and everything.
And it's hard when we're not there, right? But I will just say that there's a pretty established pattern where wherever the U.S. gets involved, the U.S. has a line at the time that is either undermined by the available evidence at the time, or like 50 years later, we get the declassified documents and we find out that the U.S. was a lot more involved and a lot more nefarious than they admitted to at the time. For example, in Iran in the early 50s, when they launched a coup, it took until this century where we got some key documents showing that they helped rile up these protests to overthrow the Iranian government at the time, because that government wanted to had the crazy idea of controlling its own oil resources and not handing them over to American and British oil companies. And so I just think we have to leave open the possibility that one day we'll find out a lot more about U.S. involvement than is already even clear now.
Well, I think that's a really key point, because, you're right. We don't know what we don't know. And I think that's a thing worth keeping in mind about this current, stoosh over Ukraine as well, because perhaps it's true that the U.S. had intelligence that Russia was going to do all sorts of nefarious things. We haven't seen evidence for that, but it could be true. It could also be true that the U.S. was putting out its messaging, its communication strategy in order to embarrass Russia or to make it climb down from whatever it was doing. And it could be that series of decisions ended up kind of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, causing a chain of events that led to the very thing that people were warning about. It's hard to know. And we may find out years from now, decades from now, I hope we do, what exactly was happening, what was the going on in the minds of the leadership, not just in the US, but in Russia. But we don't know that. We don't know anything about that now. And so, it does always kind of frustrate me a little bit when people make a lot of confident pronouncements of, this is what's going on in say Putin's mind or something. I think we can maybe take some pretty broad and I think educated guesses about what exactly he's doing. I think, I'm happy to go into that. But, this idea that, well, Putin did this speech and here's a line from the speech, and therefore that proves that this is all about this one thing. I think that's a little reductive.
On that point, like the prevailing narrative in the US right now when it comes to Putin's decision to recognize these breakaway republics in the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, is that this is just the first stop in Putin's bid to take all of Ukraine or take a lot more of Ukraine. What do you make of that? And what do you make of his decision to offer this recognition?
So one, who knows where this is going to go? I feel like just on a purely strategic level, it seems a little crazy for him to go all the way into Ukraine. I mean, that would be a huge headache for him. We know that the US has been training an anti-Russian insurgency, or at least an anti-Russian insurgency to be in Ukraine should a Russian invasion come. He's no doubt aware of that. It seems like a full-on invasion of Ukraine would be more trouble than it's worth. But who's to say? Who's to say what's going on there, and who's to say that things can't escalate to a point that happens? In terms of his recognition of these regions, I think there's a few different ways that you can look at it. I think, if you were, say, a US policymaker, you would say, aha, well, you see, this is what we were saying. Of course, this is just the start of a kind of Hitlerian expansion of Russia. This is what he's always wanted to do, to sort of reconstitute the former Soviet Union. And that's what's happening here. This is just the first stage. Another way to look at it is that what has happened throughout these months is that Putin was essentially trying to get the US towards to the negotiating table. He didn't actually invade, and even now, whether you want to call this invasion or not, he didn't send any troops in for a good long while. He sort of just kind of built up these troops as a sort of threatening measure, and he put forward these demands, pretty maximalist demands. And the US and the West more generally just sort of said, no, we're not doing any of that. We're not going to make any sort of limits on NATO's expansion to Ukraine, even though, by the way, it's not going to happen anytime soon, and we're not going to fight over Ukraine if you do anything. But when we're refusing to budge at all on this. And so one way you could look at this most recent thing is because just last week, Putin actually rejected the Russian parliament's call for him to recognize them. He said, that would be against the Minsk agreements. We have to, keep going. Suggests to me that he's maybe changed his mind about where he thinks the US and the West more generally is going to go on this, whether they're actually going to seriously negotiate. And so this could be a way for him to kind of try and escalate the situation to get the United States to the negotiating table. I mean, I think it's backfired if that was the case, because the US is now saying, no, we're definitely not meeting with them now. But that's one interpretation.
I'm guessing that Putin is responding here to the announcement from Kiev, where they all of a sudden announced, after engaging in talks about implementing Minsk, which are the only accords on record to resolve this conflict in the Donbass between Kiev and the separatist rebels, Kiev announced that they're no longer going to negotiate with the rebels, the people who control these two breakaway regions. That was just last week. And then you had Putin's announcement. So that it's my sense that he's, at least that decision to no longer negotiate with the rebels in the Donbass is what prompted Putin to basically conclude that the US and Kiev are not interested in ever actually agreeing to Minsk. And so he might as well make this aggressive move to force them into a defensive posture.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense. I think one of the things that often gets left out here is Ukraine's role in all this, the Ukrainian government's role, because obviously you can point to violations of Minsk by Russia, but also Ukraine has been pretty consistently loath to fulfill the Minsk Accords partly because of the threat from the far right, which has been very willing in the years since the Maidan Revolution to engage in street violence, to even make an attack on parliament in response to what it kind of calls a surrender. That believes that if the Minsk Accords are actually followed through on, that would be a surrender to Russia. So I think that's really important. And another way you could look at this, another interpretation, is that Putin is planning to either annex the eastern Ukraine or to carve out a separate state, basically that ends up serving as a kind of buffer between him and Ukraine that he's kind of acknowledged as now it's lost to the West. I'm not going to be able to get this back in my sphere of influence. I think all of those are possible. I think we have to remember that likely Putin himself does not have a plan. Maybe he has some sort of broad strategic goals that he would like to fulfill. I do think that he really wants to have some sort of security arrangement where basically he's sure that Ukraine and Georgia aren't going to end up in NATO, and that create that and also an arrangement that acknowledges Russia's, I guess, place in Europe and its power in Europe. I think that may be his overarching goal, but he's also someone who's reacting to events, and he's sort of improvising. And so it may be that he himself is not completely sure about where exactly this is going, and which is itself kind of scary.
And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiots.substack.com. That was great.
It was great. I didn't know that Christian Bale knew so much about Ukraine.
Oh, he does kind of look like Christian Bale right now with the long hair. Yeah.
I mean, for me, like, as we were interviewing, I'm like, am I talking to Christian Bale? And I didn't want to say that to his face because you never know when you tell someone that they look like a celebrity if they're going to appreciate that or not. It's kind of awkward sometimes. So, I was too cowardly to do it in person. Yeah. But behind his back, I'm going to declare that to me, it's uncanny the resemblance between Branko and Christian Bale. Anyway, that was a great interview. I learned a lot from Branko, as I always do. And again, as you said, Kate, he's so prolific with his articles. And to understand the crisis in Ukraine, I recommend everything he's written, especially the one we started out with about the roots of this whole conflict, going back to the coup in 2014. He gives the best summary that I've read on the events that happened there, which are just so critical to understanding what has taken place since, because they capture how the U.S. has treated Ukraine as a proxy. And it's had very disastrous consequences. Yeah. And we're living through them now.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for watching Useful Idiots, for listening to Useful Idiots, for rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to your podcasts so that we can beat the Lincoln Project and we can beat Pod Save America. Make sure that you subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on Substack. That's youtube.com/usefulidiots, and that's usefulidiots.substack.com. Also, join us on Mondays for our Monday morning live streams where we react to the Sunday morning news shows that we watch so that you don't have to. And then afterwards on Callin, the app, which is free and now available not just on iPhones, but also on Androids. Androids. So it's Monday morning at 10 a.m. on youtube.com/usefulidiots, and then Callin at 11 a.m.
And to get a bonus segment from this interview with Branko, go to usefulidiots.substack.com, where we talk about the latest in the Jeffrey Epstein saga.
Yeah, right. And also extended conversation about Ukraine and also Vaush. I don't even know how to say it.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
That was a great episode. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Hello, thank you so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For full episodes and extended interviews, please subscribe at usefulidiots.substack.com. You can subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/usefulidiots for clips, live streams, and full episodes. Also, subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod and use the hashtag UsefulIdiotsPod. Join us Mondays at 10 a.m. for the Useful Idiots Monday Morning Show, where we discuss the Sunday morning news shows so you don't have to watch them.